Hello, historians. Welcome to today's edition of On This Day in History, your daily insight into what has happened in the past and how it's influenced the events of the present. On this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. Now then, on this day, the 11th of June, well, supposedly, and this is one of those that has to come with a bit of an asterisk, on this day in 1184, during the Trojan War, this is the day that Troy was sacked. It was burned. This is the day that the Greek soldiers who had snuck into Troy in the wooden horse gift, in inverted quotes, opened the gates, and the soldiers were able to penetrate the supposedly impenetrable walls of the city of Troy. Now, keep in mind that it supposedly happened on this day in 1184 BC. So that is 3,000, what, 3,204 years ago. But that date was actually only calculated by an ancient Greek intellectual, a mathematician and philosopher known as Eratosthenes, and he came up with that date in 250 BC. So just going from the date it actually happened to the date that they said it figured out that it happened is 1,000 years, let alone the other 2,270 years to get to today. So that is amazing. So we'll take that date with a grain of salt, but it's what it can be remembered as the day that Troy fell. In the year 1509, on the 11th of June, King Henry VIII married his dead brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. Now, keep in mind, uh, Henry was actually the younger brother. His older brother, Arthur, was supposed to be king. And then, of course, he passed before he could become king. And that is how we ended up with King Henry VIII in the first place. And this whole idea that Catherine of Aragon was obviously of Aragon, that is modern day Spain. The marriage was a political one, and when Arthur died, Henry's father, Henry VII, needed to maintain that alliance. So he said, "Well, that's okay. You can just marry my other son, no problems." But it was the fact that Henry had married a widow, the widow of his brother, that ended up causing such, shall we say, consternation, as when he was unable to produce a son, he used that as the grounds that he should be allowed a divorce because he should never have been allowed to marry his brother's widow in the first place. So, lots and lots and lots to unpack there, but just so we know, it was on this day that he married Catherine of Aragon, and we assumed they live happily ever after. On this day in 1940, Italy officially declares war on the Allied nations. So Italy had been somewhat involved in World War II up to this point because they were officially an ally of Nazi Germany, of Hitler's Germany, but they had not necessarily officially declared war and officially put into place the infrastructure required to have soldiers in the field, etc., etc. But by this time in 1940, Germany had just defeated France, and France had surrendered, meaning the country that Italy shared a border with, France, was not uh, an active participant in the war at this point, and therefore not going to invade across that very border. So Italy felt safe to declare war at that time. In 1942, on this day, again, we're looking at World War II, this was a significant turning point in the war. The German army was defeated at El Alamein in North Africa. Up to that point, Ernst Rommel, the Desert Fox, commander of German forces in North Africa, had been very, very, very successful. And the North Africa campaign was essentially a race to the Middle East for oil. So German forces were trying to come across the north of Africa through Egypt into the Arabian Peninsula to take control of the oil fields to supply their army, while at the same time, the year earlier, Operation Barbarossa had begun, where they invaded Russia or the Soviet Union with the idea of chasing down through the Soviet Union through the Ural Mountains to get to Middle East oil reserves that way. So they were trying to pincer movement, trying to surround the Middle East oil fields because it was that important to them. The fact that they got turned away, this could be seen as the first sign of an inevitable defeat of Germany in World War II. If they couldn't secure the oil, they couldn't keep fighting. On this day in 1963, US President JFK makes a historic speech regarding segregation and states not only that it is a legal issue in terms of constitutionality, but it is in fact a moral issue. It is morally wrong. It is time to act. Now, this was quite a significant moment in the civil rights movement, and there will be more on that to come today. But to finish the on this day events, on this day in 1993, Jurassic Park, which was directed by Steven Spielberg, officially set the box office weekend record of $502 million. That's right, in a weekend, $502 million. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot that we need to take this with a grain of salt with today's modern box office numbers, like the Avengers movies setting billions and billions in their first weekend. This is 1993, okay? So one, the population of Earth is a lot smaller. Two, there's not as many movie theaters around. Three, you don't have the internet to spark hype. Four, this is not part of some sort of shared universe. This is not characters that exist. This is an independent, well, it's based on a book, but it is original characters in a movie. And the whole idea of it was, the draw of it was that dinosaurs were indeed alive. Now, I will just have one little quick comment here, as I like to do with movies. In actual fact, the Tyrannosaurus Rex, which is on that sign for Jurassic Park, the term Tyrannosaurus Rex, the Greek word for tyrant and lizard, so it's a tyrant lizard, and of course Rex is the Latin word for king. So he was the king tyrant lizard. That's how Tyrannosaurus Rex got its name. But more than anything else, it actually lived between 68 million and 66 million years ago during the late Cretaceous period, not the Jurassic period at all. But I suppose Cretaceous Park doesn't quite have the ring to it that might make it a box office success. So they went with Jurassic Park. But this is just one of those things where you would see that symbol with the Tyrannosaurus Rex associated with that movie all the time. It is obvious that surely the Tyrannosaurus Rex is from the Jurassic era, when in fact it is not. So remember, do not trust movies for knowledge, trust facts, trust books, and of course, trust on this day in history. Now, in terms of the deep dive, as I said, there would be more to come regarding this speech. Now, this was, of course, selected by me to speak about, not only because it is of significance at the time in 1963, but I think there could be much to learn now in the year 2020 about this particular event. So, on June 11th, 1963, JFK addressed the nation on the most pressing domestic issue of the day: civil rights for all Americans, the equal treatment of African Americans, of Black Americans in their society. So this was in 1963, when the idea of Black people being treated unequally or as separate beings or lesser than was considered to be quite the issue. So what had happened, the context for this particular speech, was that the first integration of Southern universities, so particularly the University of Mississippi and University of Alabama, which had banned Black students. You were not allowed to be a student at those universities if you were Black, despite the fact that Blacks were actually the majority of the population in those areas. But anyway, they were banned from campus. So when that was ruled to be unconstitutional, JFK sent federal troops to make sure that those students could get to classes safely. Now, keep in mind what that actually means. If you reflect upon that, that means if there is a genuine fear that if there's no police escort, those people would be killed simply for attending school, attending class, trying to get an education. That is outrageous. And second of all, this was quite a dramatic move, because this at a national level was, so the National Guard, this was not the state or local police forces, for example. At a national level, they were saying, no, no, I don't care what you believe in your state. As a nation, this is what we believe, and as a nation, this is what we will enforce. So, in this particular speech, Kennedy announced that he would be sending some civil rights legislation to Congress. Now, this would eventually become the Civil Rights Act, which is seen by some to be perhaps the most important piece of legislation that has ever been passed in the United States regarding equal rights. And it is, in fact, a fascinating period of history, in that it seems entirely overdue, and yet looking from the stance that slavery ended in the United States in 1865, why are we still having to make laws about this 100 years later? It seems entirely overdue. And yet looking back on it, we can see this is as relevant today as it was 57 years ago, which is outrageous. So this particular address, the context of it, this is a very famous picture, a very famous photo. Now, in terms of the speech, Martin Luther King Jr., perhaps you've heard of him, civil rights leader, referred to this speech by Kennedy as the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and freedom of all men ever made by any president, which is quite the emphatic endorsement of this speech. But the exact same day that Kennedy was making this speech, making this plea for justice, this is what was happening in Alabama. George Wallace defined his legacy with his stand in the schoolhouse door. So this is the governor of Alabama, the highest ranking public official in the state of Alabama. The police answer to him. All local mayors answer to him. The fire departments all answer to him. The municipality governments all answer to him. He is a very powerful political figure in the state of Alabama, and he literally stood in the door to try to stop African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, as they attempted to attend classes. So that is not just random, crazy, thinking racist guy on the street blocking the door. This is literally the guy elected to represent the interest of the people, saying, no, no, in my mind, the interest of the people are that black people are not allowed to go to school. That's outrageous when you think of it that way. Now, he had made a speech a few months earlier in which he had declared and promised his voters, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. So he was essentially saying, no, no, we will be a separated society where blacks and whites do not interact, because blacks are not good enough to hang out with whites, obviously, according to George Wallace. So when we talk about these particular events, we need to understand that this was the prevailing theory held by most people. Remember, to win an election, you have to have more people agree with you than disagree with you. So he got voted into office, and it was increasing his popularity with this stance, which is ridiculous. Okay, so the idea was he was a quote unquote states' rights advocate, which meant that states should be allowed to do what they want to do. So I stand here today as governor of this sovereign state and refuse to willingly submit to illegal usurpation of power by the central government. So you cannot, as a national government, tell me what to do in my state. We get to decide for ourselves. Now, this became the legal argument. Hey, it doesn't matter what you think of equality or inequality or racism. That doesn't matter. The argument is a legal one. The national government doesn't have a legal right to do this. Now, the problem with the states' rights issue is that if a state was to pass a law, like, I don't know, in favor of gay marriage, other states would try and get the federal government to block those laws. So it's not actually a states' rights issue. It's a, I want to do what I want to do, and you're not allowed to do what you want to do issue. So it's actually a hypocritical argument. People who bring up states' rights as an argument have not studied history. I will simply put it that way. Anyhow, so the response to this particular protest of the governor, George Wallace, was to send in the National Guard, and 100 soldiers were sent there to escort the students into campus. When the troops arrived, Wallace stepped down. He did not get arrested that day. Now then, in terms of this speech, the onset of his term, so from the very, very start of his term, remember he is elected in 1960 and he comes to office in January of 1961. So he's been in office for over 2 years at this point, but he had not said much about civil rights. Now, he hadn't been necessarily against civil rights. He certainly had not taken the stance of George Wallace. He was more silent on the issue, more not wanting to cause trouble. Now, the reason for this is because the South, where a lot of this segregation and racial discrimination was official policy and quite popular, if he spoke out against it, he might lose their votes. He might lose their support. And if he loses their support, then the members of Congress that represent those particular districts are not going to let him he pass the laws that he wishes to pass as president. So the idea was, you know what, civil rights is a big issue, but I need Southerners' support for these other particular issues. So at the moment, civil rights can wait. That was basically JFK's idea. He didn't agree with segregation, but he didn't see it as his priority when he first came to power. But with the actions of Governor Wallace, and specifically stating, excuse me, as an American state with American values, we as Americans stand for the idea that whites are superior to blacks. That made Kennedy think, no, we need to do something about this now. We can no longer ignore this issue. We can't sidestep this issue. Now, it was on this very day where Wallace was standing in the doors of the university, and Kennedy watched it on television. So this was broadcast live in 1960. Yes, they had television in 1963. This was broadcast live on television in 1963, and Kennedy watched Wallace's actions, and more importantly, he watched the level of support that Wallace had, the cheers of the crowd as he tried to stop black students from attending the university. So that made it clear that it was time to address this issue. Okay, we need to educate the public on civil rights, and then of course follow through with appropriate legislation. So as soon as they finished watching this on television, Kennedy turned towards as one of his senior members of staff, Sorensen, and said, well, we better give that civil rights speech tonight. So it was because Wallace blocked the door that JFK said, that's it, we're doing this speech tonight. So there were many other members of staff who said, what are you doing? No, absolutely not. That would give you opposition in Congress, and you won't be able to pass all these laws. But Kennedy said, enough is enough. So this was part of his speech. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is the land of the free except for the Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now, I should point this out. That is not what you would, the politically correct term these days. You wouldn't use the word Negro, but at the time, that was not necessarily considered to be an offensive term. I can only point this out that he maybe possibly could have simply said all Americans here, but at the time, this was the language that was used to discuss this particular issue. I am encouraging everyone out there to please, please, please do not use the term Negro, not at all, except when quoting Kennedy in context, please. The speech goes on to say things like, it ought to be possible for American students of any color to attend a public institution they select without having to be backed up by troops. It ought to be possible for American consumers of any color to receive equal service in places of public accommodation such as hotels and restaurants and theaters and retail stores, without being forced to resort to demonstrations in the street. And it ought to be possible for American citizens of any color to register and to vote in a free election without interference or fear of reprisal. It ought to be possible, in short, for every American to enjoy the privileges of being American without regard to his race or his color. In short, every American ought to have the right to be treated as he would wish to be treated, as one would wish his children to be treated. But this is not the case. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all. So this was at a time of large-scale division in American society, and Kennedy came onto television and radio, and he broadcast this speech live, and in the speech, he was essentially pointing out the hypocrisy of the nation. He was saying, we cannot claim ourselves to be a land of the free if we have people that are not free. We cannot claim to be the shining city on the hill, the metaphor for America, if you will, the example for the world of freedom, of democracy, if we do not treat all our own citizens that way. He also was trying to frame the argument in terms of having segregation in the United States weakened the position of the United States around the world on the global setting. Now, this is set against the backdrop of the Cold War. So this was sort of a clever maneuver to try and appeal to the patriotism that Americans would feel and their love of country, in that ending segregation is going to make America better. It's going to make America live up to its own ideals and its own promises. So he finishes his speech. He started at 8 o'clock. He finished the speech at 8:19 p.m. and he went for dinner. Okay. Meanwhile, the White House is flooded by 10,000 responding telegrams, 2/3 of which expressed appreciation, the other third of which not so much. Most of the messages coming from the south of the United States were, of course, disapproving. So keep that in mind. This is the southern states of the United States, a very large section of the United States. When a president gets on TV and says, I think we treat some of our citizens unfairly and we should treat all citizens fairly, that is what we as a nation should live up to. And a large section of society said, what are you talking about? We're not going to treat them equally. That's disgraceful. We don't do that. No, we treat them unequally. That's the American way. People genuinely believed this, okay? So keep that in mind. This is not just a small group of people. This is large sections of American society that genuinely believe this. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. watched this speech in Atlanta. And when it was over, he jumped up and said to those he was with, can you believe that white man not only stepped up to the plate, he hit it over the fence. This is obviously a reference to baseball. He hit a home run. So from Martin Luther King Jr.'s perspective, this speech was perfect. It was exactly what the nation needed. He sent a letter to the White House and he said, I've just listened to your speech to the nation. It was one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and freedom of all men ever made by any president. You spoke passionately for moral issues involved in the integration struggle. However, Kennedy's approval rating among Southern whites plummeted. In May, so before he made the speech, more than half of white Southerners approved of Kennedy. After he made the speech, only about 1 in 3. So keep that in mind. If you put 100 white Southerners in a room, you would have 33 of them say, yes, I like the president who said that we should treat everyone equally. And you would equally have 67 people saying, no, how dare the president tell me to treat black people equally? That is, from our modern day perspective, outrageous. But we need to understand the large scale of this issue. I must point this out. This was not small groups of horrible people with their horrible racist views. This was accepted in society. It was okay to treat black people as unequal, to only be kind and fair and extend justice to white people. That was considered to be an acceptable point of view in the American South, which hopefully we understand is actually a horrific point of view. Now, this was Kennedy's most dramatic statement to date on African American civil rights, and it transformed the subject from the legal issue, states' rights, if you will, into a moral one. Now, this is very important because essentially the president got out on TV and made it a national question, a referendum, if you will. Not is it a legal issue that states should be able to decide what they want? Oh, I suppose states can sort of decide the way they want to do things. Yeah, maybe the national government shouldn't get involved. You know, that sort of separates the issue. If you can actually turn it into a moral stance, do you think that it is okay? Do you think that it is acceptable? Forget about the legal ramifications, forget about the wordings of the law. Do you think that it is acceptable that American citizens are treated unfairly? It is very, very difficult to take the position of, yes, I think that we should treat people unfairly. That's a difficult argument to make. It is far, far easier to say, well, the law says that, you know, I'd love to do it, but the Constitution is, when really that's just an excuse, because it is, in fact, at its heart, a moral issue. Okay, laws can be changed. So I hope we have learned something and educated ourselves about this particular issue. This speech, which was made to educate the nation, to engage a divided nation, cost JFK politically. He lost a lot of support from a key demographic. However, he also demonstrated to a overlooked community that he was on their side. He also demonstrated that it is not simply the role of the president to enforce the law and be a powerful person, but to serve as an example. And believe it or not, it actually helped to strengthen the authority of the United States as a nation, so that when they started to condemn other nations around the world, like South Africa for their apartheid system, or nations such as the Soviet Union or China for their civil rights abuses, they themselves were able to make that argument because they themselves had that issue taken seriously by their leader back in their own country. So it actually helped strengthen the nation internationally. It helped transform the nation domestically, and it turned the argument on its head from a simple matter of constitutionality and distancing yourselves from the harsh treatment and accepting harsh treatment of others in the nation to a moral question. Is it okay to treat one group of people differently to another group of people based on the color of their skin? So that's what the argument became. So this was a transformative moment in the civil rights movement. I am not going to give JFK all of the credit for, oh, isn't that amazing? He changed everything and then the world was fixed forever. There were still many issues that existed in that time in the 1960s. And one of the larger tragedies of this particular speech and this particular example of leadership is that JFK would be assassinated 5 months later, and he would not be able to sign the Civil Rights Act into law. That would actually be done by his successor, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. More on that in another video. So I think this particular speech and this particular day is particularly relevant for our current time. As I say, it is both long overdue, 100 years after the end of slavery, and yet at the same time, it seems that in 2020, these lessons still need to be learned. I will leave you with that, and I will see you tomorrow.